Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@chymerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera 2021.
Welcome to this panel about epic tales and epic fantasy. We're joined by 2 wonderful authors today. Matthew Ward, the author of debut novel Legacy of Ash, and Mike Brooks, the author of forthcoming novel Black Coast. I would introduce them, but I think it's better coming from them. So Matthew, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm Matthew Ward. As just been said, I'm author of Legacy of Ash. By tradition, I was actually a games developer for years, and then I steadily moved into writing fictitious worlds instead of fictitious game settings. And this is kind of where I've got to now. I live near Nottingham. I have a house full of cats, which are currently shut out of the room. So if we hear scrabbling later, that will be why. But for the moment, we're all safe.
Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike Brooks. My cat just walked across in front of the camera, as you may have seen, because yeah, I'm actually in like their room where their food is, so I couldn't really shut them out. Yeah, I'm the author of the upcoming epic fantasy novel The Black Coast. I'm also the author of the science fiction series, the Kaiko series, Dark Run, Dark Sky and Dark Deeds, and I've written a couple of novels. I've actually lost count, for Games Workshop, and my history is that I worked for a homelessness charity for 15 years, and I also live in Nottingham with a house full of cats, so there's a theme.
Actually, before we move on to the questions about your books and your writing, the first question I had was about your cats. Can we get the names, age and breed of your cats, because that is vital information that everybody needs to know. And number of cats, because I know Matthew's got more than one.
Okay, so our eldest is called Theremin. She is a tabby. She's getting on for 7 years old now. Next one down is Marco, who's also a tabby. He's about 5, and he's a lot friendlier. In fact, he's the one I've been constantly throwing out in the run up to this, because he would come in, jump on top of something in front of the camera, whatever. No, go away, leave me alone. Then 2 minutes later,
he just wants attention. He just wants to be a part of the panel.
He just wants to be a part of everything, as long as it's in the way, as a general rule. Then below that we have Kynwyn. Kynwyn is 3 years old this year. She is enormous and incredibly bad-tempered. And then last of all we have Zathras, who is a black and white. He's not even a year old, and he bullies the others incessantly, so he enjoys himself.
I like that he's not even a year old and he's bullying everybody else in the household.
He's definitely decided he's in charge. The rest are just cowards, so they don't stand up for themselves.
Mike, we saw your cat's butt just a little while ago.
Yes, yes, you did. That was Nimbus. She's grey and white, as you would have seen, and I've got two cats. Nimbus, who's grey and white, and Inara, who is black. They were both rescue cats, so we're not quite sure how old they are. I think they're sort of around 4 or 5. And Inara makes no noise at all, and Nimbus makes more noise than a human walking around the house. Even though she's the lightest cat we've ever had, she just doesn't. She just stamps. She literally comes up the stairs, and you don't know if it's another human or Nimbus. All you know
She
is that
has
it's not Inara.
personality.
Oh yes, she has. She has a lot of personality and volume.
Is Inara the name from Firefly?
Yes.
Good name. Okay, now that the important thing's out of the way, we should move on to books. So Legacy of Ash and Black Coast are wonderful books, but they are very sizable and can be used as weapons. Can you tell us a little bit about your influences when writing these books? What you drew on when creating these huge epic worlds? Mike?
Influences is tricky, I guess. I think the thing about the Black Coast and the series that it's part of is it's kind of it's an evolution of an idea that had been kicking around in my brain since the mid-90s, because I started writing stuff at a very young age. It's just I never finished it. I didn't sort of get around to actually finishing a novel that I'd started until about 10 years ago. And then I'd written various things in various genres and finally got some success with the science fiction. But I came up with that story and wrote the first novel in the space of about 8 months. It wasn't anything that had been in my head previously. It just came and I started writing it, and that was the thing that worked. That's what first got me published. The thing about the Black Coast was, or what became the Black Coast, as I say, that had been in my head for years and years and years. But there was a thing of, epic fantasy is a big commitment, and it was something that had been with me for a long time. I'm not saying that I didn't care about the Keiko series, but it was very much something that I came up with, and it was fun, and I was just doing it. Whereas this was sort of felt that I wanted this to be right. And it was a case of, at what point in my writing career am I going to be at the stage where I feel comfortable writing this and I'm going to do it justice? But then various things happened, and amongst them some sort of political developments in this country, and I decided that I wanted to write a novel basically about people not being arseholes to each other. And I started to fit that into the context of a fantasy series, so sort of different peoples coming together and not fighting each other necessarily, but having to learn to work together and get on with each other. So in many ways, I suppose it was influenced by developments in the real world and wanting to write something that pushed back against that. In terms of within the novel itself,
I keep forgetting that I've read the books months ago and it's not out yet. Could you tell us a little bit about the book before you tell us the development of the world?
Can try and do that. It's about people learning not to kill each other. It's very broad strokes. There are a couple of different elements to it. One of them is a group of people having to flee over an ocean away from a possibly demonic threat, to a land that previously they've only come to as raiders, although they haven't done that for a little while, but that's how they are remembered by the people there. And they end up in a very isolated place, which they've chosen deliberately, because basically they go there and they rock up with a considerably larger force than the people who actually live there, and say, yeah, we don't want any trouble. We want to come here and live. In fact, we're going to come here and live. We don't want to cause any trouble, but there are a lot more of us than there are of you. So it's in your interest not to cause trouble for us. And then but the other thing is that this is a much larger country there are a lot of other people in there, a lot more than they have, but they're quite far away. So it's if they get discovered, then everyone else is going to come down on them in the end. So, but the problem for the people who already live there is that right here and now, they may have a lot of friends far away, but right here and now, there are a lot more people on their doorstep who are potentially hostile to them. And so everyone has to kind of work out a way of how they're going to live with each other without ending up either being killed or then having someone else come and kill them because they've killed other people. It's not that, oh, we're all going to be friends. It's a case of, this is weird and awkward, but maybe we can make it work. I guess that's probably the big narrative within the Black Coast. There's also other narratives that come a bit to the fore, more to the fore later on in the series, which is about more about gods and demons and the perceptions of those. The main country that it's set in, Nerida, is ruled by a god king who is the direct descendant of someone who is believed to be divine. But it's quite a low magic novel, and a lot of it is more about, are these things magic? Are these gods real? Are these demons real? Is it superstition? And focusing as much as anything else on, does it matter whether things are real? Because what matters is how people react to that and what those beliefs they have make them do, regardless of whether or not the beliefs are actually founded in fact. So, yeah, does that help in any way?
That does help. You did forget to mention the war dragons.
I did. I did. The war dragons are there, and the Crake, the giant monsters of the oceans. They're fun as well.
That did. Matthew, could you tell us a bit about Legacy of Ash and what influenced you to write that story?
Okay, I'll come in on the setting to start with before I forget, because otherwise I'll be wittering away and we'll have a problem. So Legacy of Ash is basically, it's a story about sins being passed down to a new generation. The Shresian Republic, which is the main setting for the story, is a place that is the remnant of what was a much larger kingdom at one point in time, but the attitudes have never really shifted as that has changed, and it's brought up all kinds of troubles from the past. They tend to rewrite their history. They tend to see things in very clear terms of this good and this bad, and if you fall on the wrong line, so help you, that will be everything over. And this is built up over generations and generations and generations. In fact, particularly relevant to the story, is when one of the counties tried to secede 15 years ago because they didn't like basically how they were being governed from the central authority, and that leads to a civil war and a permanent sort of sundering of relationships between North and South in this particular case. And when the story picks up, it's sometimes with some of the characters who were involved in that war, often with the descendants of the characters who were involved in that war. And again, they've got to make their choices about how they're going to react to their shared past when other threats come hoving in over the horizon. It's the who do you stand with and why, and how far are you prepared to go to either hold on to your past or set it aside so you can have something better in its place. So that's the very slipshod overview of the setting. In terms of inspiration, some of this is going to sound eerily similar to Mike, and I swear I'm not cribbing his notes. But the actual setting for Tressia goes back 20 odd years for me, and actually what is the culminating point of the series, in theory, I've known for that period of time. Legacy of Ash in particular, even when I sat down and started writing it, I knew how the book ended. I knew how I wanted to get to it, but I didn't have the rest of it to that point, because previously I've been terrible, because I'll go, here's a fantastic setting of stories and characters, and think, well, how does the book end though? So I thought, no, I'm going to do it right this time. I'm going to be a responsible human being. I'm just not going to know how the beginning and the middle work instead. And that was much better, except it was a little bit stressful, because quite early on it was very obvious it was going to be very, very long. And you do hear that thing with an epic fantasy book, particularly when you can see it stretching out in front of you. You think, oh my goodness, how many months is this going to take, and what's it going to look like by the time it was done? But in terms of the influence, it makes it really hard to talk about in terms of influence, because there are so many bits and pieces in there, because the story I'm telling now isn't quite the one I was thinking about 20 years ago, or the version that was 15 years ago, or 13 or 12 or whatever. But my touchstones are always, I'm always looking off to the side because I keep staring at the back of the book. I think, if I look at that, that's where the answers will come from. It's probably not going to work that way. But the touchstone influences have always been things like Tolkien, which isn't necessarily something you hear a lot of these days. But it's something I fell in love with at an early age, and it just colours through everything that I do and everything that I read. The other big one is slightly unusual, which is actually a TV series called Robin of Sherwood, which aired in the 80s over in the UK. And it was remarkable because it had a lot of that presumed mysticism around it. There was always a little bit of magic pushing up against the regular sort of swords and arrows and all the rest of it. But again, it was always left a little bit nebulous as to how much it was real and how much it wasn't. And that's definitely something that stayed with me in the years since.
Brilliant. I like that it was Robin of Sherwood. Both of you, Mike mentioned already, both of your novels focus around society, conflicts within society and the Republic, big epic scale wars or trying to prevent wars. Mike's already said that it's sort of influenced by real world situations now. Is that the same case with you as well, Matthew? Is this why this seemed like a perfect time to tell that story or actually finish it?
To be honest, I started writing it because I just hit that point and think, I think I know what the story is now, and I think I can tell it. I think my ability is the level to do it justice, because it's considerably longer than anything I've done at that point. There's a lot of stuff in there that, viewed in a certain context, looks like I've been cribbing things from the real world, but honestly, I haven't been. It's just, you go back and look and you go, yeah, okay, let's not misquote any of this at the wrong time. But a part of that, I think, is because the Terrestrial Republic very much owes a lot to my slightly cynical and jaded perception of how the UK operates as an entity anyway. And certainly, without going into horrible details, we're not at our best at the moment, shall we say.
I mean, it doesn't feel like we're living in reality anyway, so cribbing off doesn't seem like a bad thing.
No, I have seen a few things recently. I think if I wrote that down and said that someone had did it, no one would believe that it had any part in a book, but there we go.
Mike, you've worked for homeless shelters before. Has that influenced your writing politically as well? Because you said you're sort of drawing on stuff that's been happening now. Has politics from the real world made its way into the book?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly in a much broader sense. It was sort of, the Brexit vote that really made me go, no, I can't do anything about it, but I can write something about people not being, judgmental and xenophobic all the time. I mean, in terms of, I'm not sure if anything specifically from like my working life previously has made it into the books as such, but I think I worked in the homelessness sector for 15 years, and I don't think you can do that kind of work for that length of time without it having some form of impact on your opinions about people, I suppose, and society, and the role of society with regard to people. So certainly in a broad sense, that's happened. And I suppose one of the point of view characters in the novel is homeless, in the sense that she's a street kid in a tropical place, so she's not freezing, but she hasn't got anywhere to live. She sleeps wherever she can. And I suppose also thinking about it, there is a place in the novels where which is essentially, I guess, an informal hostel. Actually, I hadn't really thought about it before, but it is an informal hostel set up by an older person who provides shelter for people who need somewhere to go in exchange for a few coins. So I guess there have been some elements like that have crept in.
That makes sense. I know politics is a really heavy subject to talk about, so we should move on. Your writing process. The books, as I keep mentioning, are huge and well worth the money, because seriously, huge. What are your processes? Are you pantsers, or do you plan everything out in detail? I know Matthew said that you've said that the middle part of the book hadn't come to you when you first started writing it, but did you sit down and plan it out after you started writing it, or did you just go wherever the characters wanted to take you?
With this one, it just went where it was going, because by habit I'm a little bit of one, a little bit of another, but it will change from book to book. Some I will plan out very precisely because I know there are certain things I want to fit where they're going now. What I'm working on at the moment is horrible because it has to be planned out precisely, and I don't like doing it that way because it takes the fun away from me, because I'm not discovering the story in the same way. It makes it much more like work, insofar as it can ever really feel like work. But with Legacy of Ash, actually just discovering what was coming up as I went through was part of the process, because again, I was trying to do something a little bit different to what I'd done before, and just trying to tell a story with more characters and a lot more breadth of setting to it. And in fact, when I was having the closest I came to a real wobble with it was about, I don't know, it's probably about 100 pages or so into the book as it's printed now. And I had this wonderful, great freeing moment where I suddenly went, these characters that I didn't think have got anything to do with the story, they can actually be part of the story, and that will be fun, and I will enjoy doing that, so I'm going to do that, and it doesn't matter. And it was wonderful, because it's actually where, for a lot of people, I think, where the book comes alive, and it introduces some of the characters which people get really attached to. And if I'd have been planning it, I'd never have put them in there, because it would have felt irresponsible. But because I was kind of making it up as I went, with very broadest sense of, well, I need to get to this point, and then a thing happens to this character, and then that unlocks the other half of the book, and then eventually we'll get to the end.
So it sounds like, because there are authors who say their characters usually end up surprising them and take unexpected turns. It sounds like that's happened with you, and introducing new characters you weren't expecting to introduce.
I think one of the joys of it actually is where you get, it's going to sound horribly pretentious, but you get to a point sometimes when you're not working to a plan where it stops feeling like you're trying to tell a story and you're just remembering and writing it down, because your brain's done all the unconscious processing at the back while you've not really been going, well, it's this many paragraphs and here, and this happens here, and then we need to cut away to this. But your brain's just, no, here's the story, it's fantastic. And you stop asking yourself questions about what happens, because you know, and that's wonderful. It's something I never really get from a plan in the same way, which again is not to say I don't plan, but I prefer not doing. It's much more fun.
That's unexpected. Mike, are you a pantser or a planner?
Yeah, much as Matthew said, it's a mixture of the two. I will start to have a plan. I'll sort of sit down with a notebook or something and go through stuff. I'll have a broad idea of the main points of the story, but how I get between them can change. So things can, I'll be writing away, and can something go, oh, and this can happen and that can happen, and most of the time it won't change the main beats of the story, but it can do. But most of the time, it doesn't really change that, but it really fleshes out the background. And I found it to have the same thing with characters, because if I will know that a character needs to have a certain role in the story, but I will never, or very rarely, will have come up with that character's actual persona beforehand until I start writing them. So I don't plan characters. They just sort of start doing whatever it is they're going to do as I write them, which can be incredibly fun. Because there's one character in in the Black Coast. There's a Nalon who is a smith, and he was just going to be in the story for a purpose. And when I started writing him, it turned out he's a giant asshole, and he's hilarious. He's just really difficult, but he's also essential, and he knows it. So he can go around being really difficult, and no one's actually going to do anything to him because they need him. And he was great fun to write, but I never planned it that way. So I knew what his role was in the story. I have no idea who he actually was. So yeah, that's I suppose how it works for me. That there is a plan of, I know where I'm going to, and I generally know where I'm starting from, and I'll have certain stops along the way. But the actual route that gets taken, I find out while I'm writing it. And often I discover new things that either I'd never thought of, or I discover new things and go, oh, that's how I get there. Right, I knew I needed to get there, but now I've suddenly, through writing, something's clicked up here and it's gone, oh yeah, and this matches up with that. And then they go there, oh, and that's why that character turned up 5 chapters ago. It's like, I thought I'd just thrown them in for fun as a bit of background, but actually it turns out we need them over here. It's not necessarily a particularly conscious process.
That's actually a really good segue to my next question. Both your novels have multiple POVs, so you've got a huge cast of characters all playing vital roles mostly. The world is so big as well. Do you ever find yourself struggling with a particular plot point or a particular character because you've hit a roadblock and you can't pull all the strands together, or finding it difficult to pull strands together? And if you do, how do you overcome that aspect of it? Was that a clear question?
Yeah, I think we just weren't sure which one of us you were asking first.
Whoever wants to answer. Matthew. Since Michael's talking for ages.
Whoever, as long as it's you. I think you can occasionally get to that point, but it's more about sort of sequencing where character arcs come through. I'll often end up where I've introduced characters where I'm really I'll go, oh, it'd be good if we had a character that did this, and then I'll stop thinking about that and I'll go, no, it's too hard, I'm doing all these other things over here. And then I'll come back a little bit later and go, no, that character is really important, this is the reason why I'm really glad I had that idea. Now I should listen to me more. And then of course I get to the next one and I ignore all of that advice and I go back to trying to write them out again. But normally the characters exist for a purpose. There's something that I want them to do, but how those then stack up with what else is going on and everyone else's purpose in the story, that can change a little bit as long as they go along. And it's quite fun because, again, the minor characters do tend to come forward a little bit then and take their own little moment on the stage. And I quite like my minor characters because they can't really derail what you're doing that much. Protagonists are terrible. Protagonists and antagonists, if they do the wrong thing at the wrong time, you go back and you end up rewriting things. But minor characters, they can just shuffle in, they can do their entertaining thing and then wander off again. If I do hit a snag with something, I generally just stop writing and then go away and come back again when it's working again. Very rarely I will try and force my way through it, but having learned from a terrible bitter experience, it can involve me sitting at this desk for about 8 or 9 hours over the course of the day and go, well, so that's 200 words that I've written today and I'm not happy with about 180 of them, so why didn't I just go outside or boot up Dark Souls or something like that? So now I just cut to the middleman. I will go for a walk or I wander around Anor Londo on the PC instead and then just let the subconscious deal with it, and that tends to clear most of the problems.
Do you ever feel that you get fed up of your protagonists and prefer the minor characters? So when I'm reading something like Robert Jordan's books, for example, I hated Rand, loved Matt. Do you ever feel that way when you're writing?
If I do, it's normally a sign I need to go back and make the protagonists more interesting, because I do struggle with them a little bit, because my favourite characters in everything are always the ones that are around the side. Even if sort of TV, books, films that I love, I normally love them for the characters who aren't driving the plot, because the characters who are driving the plot, they've got stuff to do. They've got to be on places at particular times doing things, and that just seems like hard work. So yeah, a lot of the time I spend is going back, revisiting the protagonists, particularly, and go, they are likable, aren't they? We are invested. We do care about them. As long as the answer is yes, then I feel like I can move on and tell a dreadful joke with one of the side characters after that, just so I can cleanse my palate again.
Makes sense. Mike, do you ever struggle with where your characters are going? Do you ever hit a roadblock because there are so many little babies you need to deal with?
I think having multiple characters is actually really useful. It means that if I've come to a somewhere where I need a different perspective, I can use a different character, and it's certainly something that I've used in the Black Coast, but also in the Keiko novels. You got a couple of characters in very close proximity, seeing the same thing, seeing each other, and particularly if they have different backgrounds or different viewpoints, you can then contrast them. And so if you have a character who has a certain point of view, but that's not necessarily what you might call an accurate point of view, or not wholly, you can then contrast that with another character's point of view, which is equally flawed, but in a different way. And so you can show the reader that this is not necessarily how something is. It's how something is from this character's perspective, but another character has a different perspective. And you need to decide, is one correct? Is the other correct? Do both of them have something near the truth? Which is very useful for me in a Black Coast, where I can show, the leader of the new raiders that have come over to sea, and the leader of the people who are already there. They have drastically different views about a bunch of different things, including, of course, each other. And seeing it through their eyes means that you can open new perspectives, which become useful. But equally, it might be that you need something to happen where one of the main characters that you have can't be there for storyline reasons, but you still need to show it happening. So you can invent a side character who's here for this purpose and maybe has some other relevance somewhere. I have written some things with one point of view character only, and I find that a lot harder because it's so much more difficult to spring surprises in some ways if you only have the one point of view. Which kind of sounds weird, because if your reader's only got one point of view, then the reader will be as surprised as the character. But it's much more difficult to do things like, foreshadowing or dramatic irony or whatever other words we learned in GCSE English.
So you prefer sort of third person narrative rather than first person?
It's, I don't know. I mean, I like them both for different reasons and for different purposes. They can be done, both of them can be done exceptionally well. Certainly for writing something big like the Black Coast, different narrative voices just give you more options.
Both of you have written Warhammer books before. Do you think that's had an influence on you writing epic fantasy now?
No. I've only written in Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 universe, which is the futuristic sci-fi one. And that's the only one. It was those games that were ones that I've played. So I never really, despite the fact that far more of my reading, I think, is fantasy rather than science fiction. When it came to gaming, it was science fiction rather than fantasy. So I've read some of their fantasy novels, but I never really did the fantasy games. So I've never written any of the fantasy stuff for them. Certainly, there were some influences of some of the sort of Warhammer 40,000 or Warhammer 40,000 based games, particularly a game called Necromunda, which is much more sort of small and grimy and gang focused rather than big armies. And that had an impact on the Keiko series, because for that I really wanted a grimy futuristic feel, not everything swishy and white clean like Star Trek. It's sort of more like sort of Alien, Blade Runner type. You're in the future, but the future is old and falling apart in places. So that was certainly an influence, but I don't think really for the fantasy writing.
Okay. Matthew?
So mine's a bit of a dodge, actually, because what books I've written for Games Workshop. In fact, I'm not aware of anything with my name on it that is other than this. Were essentially army books and rule books. So these are effectively almost the wargaming equivalent of role-play source books, I suppose you would say, almost like gazetteer things. So they will give you very broad strokes of background and setting and depth and all the rest of it. But they won't actually, or very rarely will delve into character dynamics or actually what you would consider to be a prose story in that sense. It's often very third person, word of God, overview stuff. Towards the end of my time there, did break it up a little bit and started writing more consistent narrative text. But from that point of view, it's actually a very, very different discipline to sitting down and writing a prose novel front to back. So yeah, in terms of setting, it's weird again, because for Warhammer, I go way back to where it looks suspiciously like Lord of the Rings in a lot of places. So I don't know that I can separate it out. These days, there's a lot more distinction between the two, but it's been a few years since I've been there. So it's not necessarily something I can talk about.
What's easier now that you've written your own fantasy novels? Is it easier playing in a world that's already established, like the Warhammer worlds, or creating your own world with your novels?
Oh, it's absolutely easier doing it with your own setting because it doesn't exist. The rules are what you say they are. So for something like Warhammer, I mean, Warhammer goes back, what is it now? I'll get the number wrong. Something like 35 years, I think, at this point now. So there's this huge amount of stuff that you just have to know or not contradict if you're going to write cohesively within that setting. Whereas when you come in the first book of a series that is your world, then it's only as real as what's written on the page. And I do have those moments because I've been living with it so long. But I can't possibly say that because it contradicts this thing that I didn't write down anywhere 15 years ago that no one will know about. Oh, it's fine. It's fine.
Mike, what's easier for you?
I had a similar thing to what Matthew was saying, that I was stuck on something a while back, quite a big thing, and it was just actually I could just make the world smaller. I can make this continent not as big, and that will solve this problem, and there's nothing stopping me from doing that. But it actually, I find both ways have their own benefits actually, because certainly writing your own stuff, the only person that you have to adhere to is yourself. So you can make up your own rules, you can make up your own your own logic, your own characters, your own worlds, everything like that, which is great and very freeing. You don't have to stick to, well, this wouldn't happen like this. No, you can't have these people. No, they can't have that kind of gun. But the other thing is that if I'm writing for sort of in a Warhammer 40,000, well, Games Workshop setting in general, there's a whole lot of world building I just don't need to do. When I was writing the Keiko series, I was having this big thing. How can I want people to be able to travel faster than light. How can I make them travel faster than light in a way that satisfies me, that is not just hand wavy, essentially, a wizard did it with a lever. That's what hyperspace is. It's wizards with a lever. There's no explanation for how hyperspace works in Star Wars. You just go faster than light and that's that. At least there isn't in the movies. There may be somewhere in some deep delve novel. I don't know. So I actually went researching through various theoretical forms of faster than light travel to try and find one that I felt was vaguely feasible, because I didn't want to just do light speed magic. When I'm writing for Games Workshop, how do people fly faster than light? They fly through hell. That's how they do it. They fly through hell and they come out the other side. Does that make sense? No. Does anyone care? No. Sorry?
Hugely distinct from light speed magic.
Yeah, well, no, it is light speed magic, but someone else has said that it's light speed magic, and that's how it works. I don't have to make it make sense because I'm writing in someone else's playbook. So it's great from that point of view. Because I've been part of the hobby since the early 90s, I know a lot of it very, very well, even with the various evolving lore over the time. So I can sit down and go, yeah, I know how this works already. I don't have to do a whole load of background reading. Some bits, yes, the little details, but the broad stuff, I know how this works. I can just start writing. I've written bits of fan fiction over the years anyway. So it is a double point of lower effort versus I can do anything I want. So I'm happy both ways, to be honest.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you've done space operas and books like that before, Mike. What's drawn you to fantasy and epic fantasy? Was there stuff that you'd read before growing up, like fantasy novels that you'd read growing up? Was there a particular thing about epic fantasy, like clothing or the food or something like that, that you wanted to include in your own novels?
I don't know. I've loved it for basically forever, since I was old enough to read it. I think I read The Hobbit when I was like 6 or something, and read Lord of the Rings when I was about 8. Black Riders are terrifying when you're 8. And I just went on from there. I mean, one of my all-time favorite series, at least in terms of the impact it had on me when I was reading it, was Tab Williams' Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. That was just sort of the richness that was there really appealed. I will often just be happy with an epic fantasy. I've read loads of them. I have loads more I want to read. I can't really tell you why it appeals so much. I don't know of anything in particular. It's just there is something about it that appeals in some sense, and that I wanted to recreate myself in some way.
Even the contemporary ones, like moving away from orcs and elves and all of that to stuff like Brian McClellan now, for example, where you don't have any of those races, but it's still wars, heavy wars involved. So even that kind of contemporary, not fantasy novel, you still enjoy, or is there the more traditional stuff?
No, I think they have different strengths and different things about them appeal. I think probably now I more prefer stuff that's focused around humans. So, there can be magic and everything like that. That's great. I love it. But I like, there are certainly historically there are some questionable stereotypes based into the various different races and species that might inhabit a fantasy world. But I find humans the most interesting. It's another reason why Star Wars is kind of a bit different, because that's just like a fantasy in space. But in terms of space stuff, science fiction stuff as well, I'm not hugely a fan of things involving aliens, because I certainly wouldn't really want to try and... I mean, again, Games Workshop is different because it's already all established. And orcs are football hooligans in space, and they're hilarious. But I find it's the human stories that are the ones that appeal to me. Take humans, put them in an unfamiliar setting, and that really appeals.
What about you, Matthew? Was there a particular draw to fantasy for you, or?
I just like, I'm quite a simple soul, so I like things that feel more tactile, and particularly there are plenty of places in this country particularly where you can just walk away from civilization. You could find yourself in something that certainly you can stop and think, no, this feels like it belongs to something else. And of course it doesn't. It's a castle. It was built by people much like ourselves hundreds of years ago. There's no magic involved, this, that and the other, but it's more approachable than spaceships and laser guns and this, that and the other. See, that's me boiling down science fiction to spaceships and laser guns. There we are. The hate mail will flood in. But I like that sense that you get in places where you can just stand around, you can just absorb the feel of how it is and see how it might be slightly different. Just when you get a place that is normally incredibly busy and you're there at just that time where it's completely dead, and it just changes the atmosphere completely. Sadly, for one reason or another, we've got a lot of that at the moment. I'm miles away from any of them, so I can't go and wander around. But it's that immediacy of fantasy because it, rightly or wrongly, it feels closer to the world we live in. Whereas science fiction is always a lot more aspirational. There's always that gap. Always, again, I'm definitely getting hate mail. But the traditional perception is there is that gap of here's the big change that has made our society this society. It's one we can't cross, but not at the moment. But let's talk about it for a bit and see what happens to the people in this story. So yeah, I just like the tactility of fantasy, I think.
It's the world building as well, which you excelled at with Legacy of Ash, if I may say so myself. We're coming to an end, so I'm just going to ask you one quick question. We're in the middle of lockdown. What are your lockdown reads? What would you recommend everybody read? I mean, other than your own books, which are, like I mentioned, sizable and will take a couple of days of pure enjoyment.
I'd definitely recommend Legacy of Ash because you're not going to get out of the other side of lockdown before you finish it. I read it before this, actually, so I had some vague idea of what Matthew was talking about, and it doesn't die. It's like, I'm a fast reader, and I was just throwing through this thing going, how much? I mean, it wasn't a problem because I was genuinely enjoying it, but just how much more of this is there? That is sizable.
And the Kindle especially, right? Because you don't realize how many pages are left, so you keep reading. You're just like,
you've got this little track bar on the right hand side. Trying to think what else I've read recently. I'm going to pass over to Matthew while I try and remember what else I read before I read his.
Matthew, who terribly doesn't really read that much anymore. I think where you've got an opportunity in a chunk of time, the best thing you can always do is sit down and just dig into a series of something that you love or something you've always been meaning to read but have never got around to it. So I think for the 3 people in the world who haven't done this so far, there is no better time to dig into the world of Pratchett because it's just wonderful. I think if you're not familiar with it, I'd probably come in about book 6 in Weird Sisters. Because the early ones, sorry?
Mort
is great. It's always because then you get sorcery after Mort, and sorcery is a slightly difficult one as well. So I feel like, look, here's a great one, and here's a more challenging one. But it's definitely Mort's the first sliver of it. But when you get to Weird Sisters, it's starting to move a little bit away from almost fantasy satire into just damn good stories in their own right, and you're not. The humour becomes a lot more natural. He really hits his stride at that point, and then it's just fantastic from there. So I think, yeah, even if you don't read fantasy as a rule, read it for the humour, read it just for that wry, bitter cynicism that he brings to every page. It's wonderful stuff. But you all know this already. This is a fantasy convention. Come on, you've all read it. Go and read it again.
Mike?
Let's see. Trying to think of a few things because I think Matthew's done very well with Discworld because there's how many books in that? That's a very easy answer. That'll keep people occupied for ages. Let's see, things that I've enjoyed or that I think are good.
It doesn't have to be stuff that you've read over lockdown. It can be just books that you love and people should read.
Yeah. Okay. So there's I can't remember if the series actually has a series name, but it was there's a trilogy of books by K. Arsenault Rivera, Tiger's Daughter, Phoenix Empress, and Warrior Moon, I think, without looking at my bookshelf, which I found absolutely great. It's I think the best way I could describe it was if you sort of were to hear like a Japanese folk tale, say. These novels read like the original events that got condensed down into a Japanese fairy tale. So it's very much sort of certainly I think influenced by that part of the world, and the writing is wonderful and the characters are wonderful and it's brilliant and queer and great.
Speaking of lockdown, how would your protagonist deal with lockdown?
Mm.
Mike,
Well,
you've answered this question once before.
I have, yeah. Let's see now. No, now I'm going to have to remember all my characters' names when I've been editing a document for the workshop today. Let's see. Sana is the leader of the Raiders. She's her chief, and I think she's a very sensible person, and she's quite persuasive. That's why she's a good chief. I think she'd be very much enforcing the lockdown because she views that it would be the best thing to do. Good for everybody. Damon, who ends up being the leader of the people who already live there, the Neredans, he'd expect people to hold to it, but that's because he comes from a much more authoritarian culture, and so he would expect people to do what he told them because it was him telling them to do it, rather than necessarily because he was that bothered about whether or not they believed it was a good idea. And Jaya, the homeless kid, she's got nowhere to be locked down in, so she'd just be out and about wherever she was anyway.
So none of them are going to be sitting around in their pajamas just eating the whole day.
No,
like everybody else is doing.
Damon's brother Daryl would. He would just be getting on with his going through his library, and not really bother about the fact that he can't go outside.
Matthew?
So it's relatively straightforward. I think it's helped by the fact of what we'll broadly say are the four protagonists. He said holding up three fingers. There are four fingers. I can count. The four protagonists, two of them are actually in lockdown at the start of the book anyway. They are actually locked up in their ancestral home because of things what their parents once did, So probably kind of business as usual for them, which is trying not to kill each other.
Like authors, fantasy authors.
Yeah, a little bit, I guess. But fewer cats, actually. The cats are all somewhere else in that setting, and not as friendly. But so that would be Kalen and Jasiri Tiralan. Our third named protagonist on the cover copy of the book would be Victor Cadra. What he would do with it would very much depend on whether he thought the reason behind it was the right thing to do or not, and who had told him to do it. I think that's probably fair to say. But whichever way he swings on it, it will be a good 95, 98% with no flexibility, no variance until the wheels come off. And then he'll just keep going anyway. And our fourth one, which is Milana Saranel, it would probably depend very much on whether people told her it was to do with tradition or not, because if it was, then no chance, straight out of the door and gone. But if she was left alone to think about it and actually come to her own opinion, she probably concluded it was quite a good idea and maybe she should stay put.
Nice. Last question. Elevator pitch for your books. Matthew, go.
The last question, it's the hardest question, isn't it?
You're
no,
being
I don't
kind.
have one, I'm sorry. I can't say anything that we haven't really talked about so far. It's a story of a new generation fighting to overcome the mistakes of the old. That's it in a nutshell.
Perfect. Mike?
Different cultures trying not to kill each other against the background of possible gods, questionable demons, and dragons.
War dragons.
War dragons. Not all of the dragons are war dragons. Some of them are just wildlife.
Keep saying war dragons.
War dragons. War dragons.
Okay, that's all I've got, and I think that's all we have time for as well. Because I have no idea when your books are coming out. I'm not your publicist or anything. Just to confirm, Black Coast is out on the 27th of August, right?
I believe so. Yes, I mean, it's I'm still waiting to see what this whole lockdown and pandemic thing does to any sort of publishing schedule. But so far as I'm aware, 27th of August, yeah.
And Legacy of Steel, which is Matthew's second book, is the 5th of November. Legacy of Ash is out now in paperback. Yeah. I think that's it. Anne, are you still there?
That was a shocking wrap up. Do a better one.
I know, right? I was just like, wait, what am I saying?
You can at least thank people for watching.
Thank you so much for joining. Go out and buy those books.
Sorry?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me for a fantastic panel.
Wait, hold on. I can't read my handwriting. I did have a wrap up written out. Okay, let me just try that again.
You need some kind of computer with a screen on it that you can type it up on.
Right? Okay, I'll try that again. I think that's all we have time for. And just to, what was I saying? Shush. Look, starting and wrap-ups I can't do. All right, I think that's all we have time for. Matthew's Legacy of Ash is available in paperback at the moment, and Legacy of Steel is out on the 5th of November. Right? And Mike's debut epic fantasy is the 27th of August. Hopefully, if publishing doesn't change its schedules. They're all available for pre-order as well. So go get.
And I'm just going to get a quick plug in that my next novel for Games Workshop, which is called Brutal Cunning and is their first novel from the perspective of an orc, is coming out in August, I think.
Big month for you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was absolutely lovely talking to you.